Hi, I'm Dr. Daphne Wiles. I'm one of the course mentors for MZC1, and this is a recorded webinar for memory, which is part of Chapter 6. Our learning objectives for memory are to be able to identify the different components of the information processing models, to be able to talk about some factors that promote retention, and then be able to select some strategies that you could use to enhance long-term memory. We'll begin by talking about the information processing model. The first step of the information processing model is the sensory register. So this is a holding area for information coming in from all of your senses. So everything that you're seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting and feeling, these are all this information is coming in to your sensory register, and most of it you're not even aware of at all. Because that information, if you don't pay attention to it, it's quickly lost. And this has some pretty serious classroom implications because you have to pay attention to something in order to retain it. And so when students are sitting in your classroom and you're talking about the Revolutionary War and they're maybe not really hearing you, they're smelling what's being cooked in the cafeteria, and maybe they're listening to a conversation that their friends are having, and maybe they're daydreaming about something that happened that morning. You need to pull in their attention and let them know where they need to focus, so that the information from their sensory register will start moving into short-term and then possibly long-term memory. So building off of that, attention is a limited resource. So when you're sitting in a classroom, you have to be able to know where you need to put your attention, to know what you need to remember. You cannot focus your attention on everything around you at the same time. And so as a teacher, you're going to need to know when you need to ask for your students' attention, let them know this is important, I need your attention so that you can remember this. When you pay attention to something, it can start moving that information out of that sensory register and into your short-term memory or working memory. Those terms mean the same thing. In your short-term memory, you can usually remember about 5 to 9 distinct things. So a random list of, say, 5 to 9 things, perhaps on a grocery list. One way that you can enhance this is if you start grouping information. So for instance, if you have a list of things that you need for school and you have a whole bunch of things you have to remember, then maybe try grouping them into saying, well, what do I need for my math class? Okay, I need my ruler and my pencil and my book and some scratch paper and a calculator. Now, what do I need for my English class? Well, I need to bring my book that I was reading and my book for that class and my binder. So you can remember some more things if you group them together. Things in your short-term memory are stored there until you stop thinking about them. But there are some ways that you can move them from short-term memory into long-term memory. And one way to do that is by rehearsal, which is where you go over something over and over and over again in your mind to try and hold it in your short-term memory. Another important aspect of short-term memory is to understand that the more you know about something, the easier it is to absorb new information. And this really goes back to Piaget and assimilation and accommodation. And when you assimilate new information, you already have those mental structures set up so that you can bring in new information and it just flows. When you are learning something totally new for the first time, you're having to do a lot of accommodation, accommodating this new information, and that takes much more mental energy and it's a lot more difficult. So if you already know about something, then you're just kind of connecting all of that new information to what you already knew. So once you move something from short-term memory to long-term memory, then you remember it for a much longer period of time. We have a very large capacity of long-term memory. In fact, research says that we don't even live long enough to fill up our long-term memory. And there are 3 types of long-term memory. There's episodic, semantic, and procedural. And episodic memories and semantic memories are both stored in your cerebral cortex, and procedural memories are stored in your cerebellum. Episodic memories are those where you've had a personal experience and you kind of think back and you can describe lots of things about that experience. So for instance, your high school prom. If somebody says, can you describe that? You might think, oh, I can tell you what I was wearing and what our theme was and who my date was and how we got there and where we ate dinner and all of these things. So as you're thinking back and describing all that, you're drawing on your episodic memories. Semantic memories are facts and knowledge. So if someone says, can you recall the 50 states and their capitals, those are going to be semantic memories. And then procedural memories are how you do things. So if you have learned how to ride a bike and then you go back and try to ride a bike again, those are going to be procedural memories as you get back on the bike and you're able to ride that. How to change a light bulb, how to make your grandmother's apple pie. These are all procedural memories. One problem with our memory is that sometimes we can forget. And there are some reasons why forgetting occurs. And a big one is something called interference. And interference happens when you don't have any time to rehearse the information. So we talked about rehearsal. You can move something from your sensory register into your short-term memory by going over that information over and over again in your head. If you don't have any time to do that, then it's just going to leave. It never makes it into short-term memory. And an example of this is checking the time. So if you've ever looked down at your watch or looked at your phone to see what time it is, and then somebody asks you a question, or your computer dings that you just got an email, or the phone rings, or there was something distracting out the window or something, and that pulls your attention away before you have time to really focus on the time, then you have no idea what time it is, even though you just looked, and so you have to look again. And so that's a classic example of interference. There's also something called retroactive inhibition, and this is where you have a piece of information that you know. For example, you know the letter B. You know how to write it. You know what it looks like. You could pick it out of a lineup of other letters. But all of a sudden, then you learn the letter D. And this new information is very similar to the old information. And now this messes up your memory. And you can't always remember the difference between, say, B and D. So it's because you've introduced some new information that is similar enough to the old information that it causes confusion. Some ways to remember, you need to think about the fact that there is something called a primacy and a recency effect. And a primacy effect means that you tend to remember things that are presented first, and a recency effect means you tend to remember things that are presented last. And this is very important in the classroom. This is why a lot of times when you start a lesson, you kind of go over with the children what you're going to be teaching, and then you go through the lesson, and then at the end you kind of do a recap of everything that you learned. And that helps with that primacy and recency effect. Automaticity means that you can do something with very little mental effort. So, for instance, Olympic athletes, they just look so natural when they are out doing their sport. And this is because they have practiced so much that they don't have to think about, where do I set my ice skate down on the ice, or where do I place my hands in this tumbling routine, or, how is my arm going to come into the water while I'm doing my freestyle stroke. With all of these things, these athletes have practiced so much that it just feels right when they are doing their sport. And it's the same thing with, say, driving your car. Maybe sometimes you drive to work and you don't even really remember getting there because you have so little mental effort having to go into the actual act of driving. So these are things, if you've practiced lots and lots and lots, then you remember to the point of it being automatic. There are some ways to practice. If you practice, then it helps you to remember. And so you can do something called either massed practice or distributed practice. And massed practice means that you do all of your practicing all at one time, whereas distributed practice means that you practice little bits over time. And homework is an example of distributed practice. And the research shows that distributed practice is more effective than massed practice. Another type of practice is enactment, and this is where you learn by doing, so getting really involved in your learning. And then generation is a type of practice where you actually create something. So going back to the Revolutionary War example, let's say that you're teaching that, you could have students practice by creating, say, a journal of one of the soldiers, or writing a play or a song or a poem or something where you are generating something new using the information that you learned. There are some strategies for your memory, to improve your memory, and one is paired associate learning. And with paired associate learning, that means that you need to remember things in pairs. This would be like a state and a capital. Those always are going to be going together. And one way to do this is using imagery, where you might imagine something memorable, like a picture that's memorable, but it can't be a very common picture. It needs to be something that would stand out. And then you pair that picture with the word. So, for example, the word ciao. Ciao is a greeting in Italian. And let's say you want to remember that ciao means hi. So you might think, well, ciao also kind of means food, and you would have food at a restaurant. So you might get a mental picture of yourself saying hi to somebody eating in a restaurant. And that might help you remember the word ciao. There's also free recall learning. And when you do free recall learning, you are having to memorize a list of ideas or terms, but they don't have to be in any particular order. So if someone just said, can you name all 50 states, then you could name them in any order and still meet the task. You would have all 50 states. And finally, there's serial learning. And with serial learning, you have a list of terms, but they have to be in order. For example, say songs and the Pledge of Allegiance, those words that are in those are in a particular order, and that's the way that you need to remember them. So some ways that you can do this. One is the loci method, and this is kind of where you move around the room. So, for example, if I had a list of words, say cat, hat, rat, mat, and I had to remember those 4 words in that particular order, then I might look to my left, and on my left there's a chair, and so I'm going to picture a cat sitting on the chair, and my cat is going to be wearing a hat. So in my mind, when I look at that chair, I see a cat wearing a hat. And then next to my chair, I have a fireplace. And so in front of the fireplace, I'm going to envision a rat sitting on a mat. And so this could go on for a much longer list of words. But as you're moving around your room, you are picturing these different terms on pieces of furniture or in particular areas in the room. Another type of serial learning is peg word method, and this is where you take the words 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as high as you want to go, and you pair them with words that rhyme. So, for example, the word sun rhymes with 1. So, if I'm trying to memorize, for instance, the colors of the rainbow in order, then I would say, well, 1 rhymes with sun, and red is the first color in the rainbow, so I'm going to picture a red sun. So sun, 1, it's a red sun. 2, shoe. Shoe rhymes with 2. Orange is second, so I'm going to picture an orange shoe. Then you could keep going. For 3, you could picture a yellow tree. For 4, you could picture a green door. And for 5, you could picture a blue beehive. So you get these mental pictures, and this is just trying to draw on different parts of your brain to help you remember. So you've got these colors and these associated words to help you. You also have something called initial letter strategies, and this is where you take the first letter of each word of the list that you need to memorize, and then you come up with some kind of funny phrase. So, for example, King Philip came over from Great Spain is a nonsense, funny little phrase, but it tells you the biological classifications of kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And so if you use those initial letter strategies, it'll help you recall just by having that funny little phrase. You can go back and recall the order of the words. All right. If you have any questions about memory or anything else in MZC1, please feel free to email a course mentor at edpsych@wgu.edu. Thank you.